Yeah. Someday they'll be friends.
Yeah, exactly. How about the rest of you guys?
I'm a dog person.
Dog people?
Dog people.
We're kid people. We don't need any more responsibility. Stop.
Yeah.
We had a sweet dog for 14 years that my boys grew up with, but we lost her in 2018, and I wanted to replace her, but Rick says no, we're ready to be grandparents only now. So
oh, sad, but good.
We're zero animals.
Well, Shanette and I are definitely dog people, and you've probably seen if you watched any of my videos and stuff. But
and rat people.
Show them Makai's baby.
I don't know where it is. She took it somewhere. But anyway, so with this though, the reason I asked that is, Brian was talking about how dogs so symbolize a lot of the characteristics as Paul's talking about here in the fruit of the Spirit. And what Paul is doing in Galatians is he starts talking about the works of the flesh and how that leads to ultimately divisions and dissensions and difficulties and striving and anger, and then transitions into, in contrast to that, the fruits of the Spirit, which is that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. And he talks about how there's a difference between the works being the things that we do and the fruit being the things that come out of us naturally, right? Like a cherry tree does not try and produce fruit. Fruit just is something that is birthed out of its nature. And I wondered, as we've been kind of talking about that and wrestling with it, what are some differences that we could pull from that for the spiritual life between working for our faith and having fruit come out of it? What would be some of the differences or ways that might kind of reframe how we look at spiritual maturity? Thoughts?
Well, I don't have a lot of thoughts. That was a hard one, Trevor. So I grew up Lutheran, so I'm still Lutheran in my heart. So saved by grace alone was a big thing. So the fact that Jesus died to save us regardless of our sins, and that forgiveness and that blessing is waiting for us just to ask, was always a big thing. That's how I was raised in my faith. So from that sense, the works and the fruits seem pretty natural for me. So I don't have much of a thought. Maybe someone else can build upon that. I will throw that out there.
Well, and that is kind of the heart of the book of Galatians, right? Like in the first 4 chapters, Paul actually is really angry at the Galatians and is sort of chewing them out for going back to works, right? Like, you've been saved by grace through faith alone. Like, why are you trading that gospel? Like, if he literally says at the start of chapter 3, like, who has bewitched you? And there's this, like, why are you going through all this effort again to try and earn your salvation or to earn your maturity? It's not about the work, it's about the fruit, it's about the faith. And I guess the heart of my question is, how does that analogy shift, right? If spiritual maturity isn't about all the works, what does that mean about it being, fruit, right? Like, how does that play out in our lives? What does that look like?
Well, I think if I look at what are the fruits sometimes in myself, or when I'm talking to my adult sons or whatever, is are you being obedient to the Lord? Because if you're not being obedient to the Lord and seeking His will, your life is not going to be fruitful. Mm-hmm. So that's what I always look for is, okay, why do I not feel like I'm seeing fruit in my life? Well, because I'm not doing the Lord's will, and I'm not obeying, and I'm not seeking His will.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, go for it, Sarah.
My computer keeps freezing, so sorry if it does. So I think sometimes it's hard to see the fruits of the Spirit because we are too proud and too self-absorbed. So I think that gets in the way. Is our own thoughts, our own brain gets in the way of, well, we did something good, and instead of going, okay, that was the work of God, we're like, I don't, either you're too proud or you aren't proud where you should be. I think we get in our own way of the fruits of the Spirit in our life.
Yeah. I like that because, there's this idea of, are we focused on us or are we focused on God, right? And if you boil it down, the works of the flesh are things that come out of us being over focused on ourselves. Like, I want my life to be my way, and I want everything, right? I want church to be my way. I want, I want my job to be my way. I want my kids to be my way. I want whatever. And then the fruit of the Spirit is the other, where it comes from the surrender to God and say, I want me to be your way, God. And then trusting that God will develop that. And I, thinking about this in terms of our little fun furry friends, there's this place where they don't have to strive to be faithful or to be loving or to be kind. Like that just comes out of their nature. And I was thinking about this in terms of a Indian preacher that I listened to. His name's Zach Poonen. I think he's probably dead now. It was years ago. But he talked about the nature of a person who is saved. And he said there's a world of difference between a pig and a cat. Meaning that if you have a room and in the center of the room you have a mud pile or whatever, if you put the pig in the room, the pig wants to run to the mud and play around in it. If you put a cat in the room, the cat wants to stay away from it. And he said, now you can chain a pig to the wall and keep it from getting in the mud, but its inclination, its desire, and its tendency is to want to run into that mud puddle and make a mess, right? Whereas a cat might, in the process of running around in this room, fall in the mud occasionally, but it doesn't want to. And his analogy with that is on the sense of our religiousness, we can chain ourselves out of rolling in it by our works and by discipline and constraint and all these things. But where does our heart want to go? What comes out of us naturally? Do we want to run and play in the mud, but we've built all these rules and structures and works that keep us from doing that? Or do we want to stay clean and just kind of occasionally fall in the mud puddle? Anyway, and I thought that was a pretty profound way of looking at my own heart. Like, what is it that what am I drawn to, right? And I think that comes down to this idea of surrender and the fruit coming out of us. I was thinking about this in terms of Brian's analogy of a dog rolling in it, right? And that even though we may want to do what is good, sometimes we roll in it. And Makai, I went down to visit my parents a while ago and get out of the car, and we're saying hi, and Makai's running around in the yard, and they live kind of out in the country. And then Makai comes running up, and my stepdad reaches down and pets her and goes, "Oh, it's so good to see you, Makai," and then pulls his hand back, and it was just covered in deer stuff, right? And just stunk. And so the first 10 minutes seeing my parents, we have to go give Makai a bath. And just the analogy of that, like sometimes we roll in stuff and it just stinks, right? So I wondered what is kind of in regard to that, what are some ways that we roll in it as Christians, that even though we have this good desire and these good hearts, what are some ways that we sort of stink up the world around us?
Well, Pastor Brian shared in his sermon that when we allow ourselves to get angry and argue, like argue on social media and things like that, and you just go down the path of letting anger take over in your actions and in your words. That's definitely stinking it up.
Right. Yeah, we can definitely do that with our Facebook posts.
Yeah.
I think just the way we can misrepresent God based on our own culture or outlook or desires. We it may not even be necessarily bad, just misrepresenting God out of selfishness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Self-focus, you stink it up when you're self-focused instead of focusing on others. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. We focus on our agenda instead of God's agenda.
Right. And then we carry that into the world, right? I was thinking about Brian saying that really his dogs do the fruit of the spirit well, except self-control, and they're working on that. And I would push back a little on that personally, because I think, certainly even a puppy is going to be faithful and joyful and all that, absolutely. But you also form your pet into your image, right? There's this aspect of the dog that becomes a reflection of its master. And so you have dogs that are angry and snap and are unsafe and aren't loving and aren't joyful, but that's because of who their master is, right? And yet at the same time, you have dogs that are joyful and pleasant and fun and safe and faithful and kind. And there again, that's a reflection of their master. And I think about that in regard to us as Christians. And if you're looking at the way you interact with the world, do people see our good master reflected through us? Like, do we allow the Spirit of God to transform us inside so that we reflect who God is, right? And I think if we each sort of listed a few things that we would say describe God, what would those be? I mean, just some basic things that we've talked about as Christians. Like, what are some of those things that would reflect God?
I think loving, caring, forgiving.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Patient, unconditional love.
Right.
He'll take you no matter what.
Grace-filled.
Mm-hmm. Caring for others more than ourselves. Were you going to say something, Marjane? Oh, okay. I thought you were unmuting there. And yet sometimes Christians have a very different reputation, right? I mean, we're not always known as being the most patient or the most forgiving or the most kind. Where does that disconnect come from? Like, why do we get so far off base from what our master and what we know our master wants us to be? And I don't have a clear answer to this, but it's a frustration of mine, right? Like,
I think it has to do with following man instead of following God. So, if you're going to a church, if your focus is the church instead of the focus being God, that might not put you in the right place. Or, you're following your pastor, but maybe the pastor isn't the greatest pastor. Maybe the pastor's not following God. So, like you say, it just all comes downhill.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it goes back to just being self-absorbed a lot of times, and we just follow in the ways of the world and lose that focus on God.
Mm-hmm. I like what you're saying there, Bettina, about the place where maybe even the pastor kind of takes the focus off of God, like you were saying, Tracy, where it becomes about the person or the organization, the institution, and stuff gets twisted. And feel free to keep jumping in on that. Somebody once said, how is it that we took this amazing grace-filled gospel of life transformation and turned it into something that is all about rules and works and structures to the point where people don't want it, right? And that for me is the saddest part of this whole deal. And I think it's in large part because we get focused on the stuff like you were talking about and miss out on just letting the Spirit of God bring out the goodness inside of us. So with that though, Paul, the last three that we're talking about as far as the fruits of the Spirit were faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And those three seem pretty passive, right? Like those three fruits of the Spirit sound like, okay, well, I'm just faithful and good, and I'm gentle all the time, and I just have my self-control. But that's not what we actually see in the way Paul is describing this. In fact, he's writing this book of Galatians, and he is angry at the people who are pushing for works and rules. Even goes so far as to say they should just castrate themselves, which I can't imagine ever saying in a sermon. Right? So obviously Paul is not calling for this sense of meekness, but meekness is the wrong word, calling for this passivity where we don't care. But he's still saying, in this sense, we need to be faithful and gentle and under control. How does that work out for us in our world, right? Where we can be righteously angry, but still be faithful, gentle, and self-control. What are some ways that we can kind of weigh that out in our world?
I don't know what necessarily ways, but I think understanding and knowing what you believe and standing for what you believe, I think that's a huge part of it. I think when you have whether it's, biblically, politically, whatever, like wherever you're at on the subject, you have to know where you stand and what you believe and why you believe in it and what values go into that. I think that's where you run into problems of swaying off the path and away from God, is you're now standing behind what's right or what morals are good.
Right, where you're not standing.
I don't know how to word that very well, but yeah.
Well, just looking at today's news and today's sufferings of everything going on right now and the things we get upset about just scrolling through the news, that takes a lot of self-control right there. I think I just have to say, Lord, I trust you're going to make good from this, and I give it to you and make fruit from this somehow, because there's a lot of frustration right now going on, in our little world, little bubble. Right. So, and it's hard to not let anger overtake you. So some days, so yeah.
I definitely know that.
I think it's important, especially during these times, to seek first to understand. And I think that's a way you can show gentleness and self-control, is to realize that the people you either don't agree with, or if you don't understand why they're protesting or don't understand why they're complaining, they have a different life experience than you do. Something has happened in their lives and you don't know their journey, and they don't know your journey either. But it's really important to listen and educate yourself and see maybe we have more in common than you think, or maybe you have some empathy that you can develop some empathy and actually get those fruits, get what good can come out of this. But if you don't understand where they're coming from, it makes it hard. That's how Christians get a bad name, I think, is by not listening and just imposing.
Right, just demanding. And
I mean, I think you hit on something, Melissa, is that, we think our experience is everyone's experience. So if I've never experienced injustice, then you certainly haven't, or vice versa. And that's, we don't learn from each other. We're not listening to each other. We can't see beyond ourselves. And I think it speaks to how we don't understand the body of Christ, and that if we all had the same experiences, good and bad, the body would be stunted. It wouldn't grow. It wouldn't be dynamic. It wouldn't be a living thing. So, I think we talked about it before, like listening to each other's experiences and accepting it, not telling someone their experiences are something that they're not, I think is important in our world right now.
Yeah, exactly. Were you going to say something, Aaron or Bettina? You guys unmuted and good again.
There we are. Yeah, you mentioned, anger and thinking about the fruits of the Spirit and Jesus and how he reacted. The analogy that comes to mind is, do you ever watch a TV series and you really get attached to a character, and maybe the writers are swapped out halfway through season 3, and the character starts doing things that are really inconsistent. Like, I know this character and they wouldn't do that. This makes no sense. It's frustrating. It's crazy. I think consistency is important. And you see Jesus, whether he's showing compassion to the woman at the well, or showing mercy to the woman caught in adultery, or whether he's forming a whip and driving the money changers out of the temple, you feel like he's the same character. He's consistent. His motives, his ethos remains the same. And I think we can tie a lot of that into faithfulness, in that we're consistent because we're plugged into the same source. We're bearing the same fruit, no matter what the circumstances are around us. Our response may be very different, but the character is the same. The consistency is the same.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And actually thinking about this in terms of kind of all of the crowdsourcing, what you guys were all saying. I mean, there's this sense of I stand. There's a sense of I allow others their space to do their own thing. I have a consistency of nature and character. And sort of boiling that down, right? It's being rooted and grounded in yourself, and not being controlled by the world, but allowing the world to be around you and just speaking into it. And the psychological term would be self-differentiation. But this sense of it's okay for whatever situation I'm in to be whirling around me, but I'm going to stay grounded in God and who I am, right? Where he's the master. And so kind of in line with that, and that faithfulness, that consistency of character, right? The word in Greek, as Brian said, it means being reliable and trustworthy, like consistent, reliable, trustworthy, and this sense of like, yeah, I am who I am. I won't go into too many details, but there have been times in my life when I have gotten overwhelmed or overly frustrated, and all of a sudden became very different than I was before.
I've never seen that.
You've never ever seen that, right? And yeah, I became unfaithful in that moment. And I think in theory, the more we walk with God, the more God kind of keeps, wearing those edges down and forming us into his image. But, sometimes we still roll in it. So I'll apologize to my wife publicly for that. But yeah, this idea of faithfulness. So Brian tied it into Micah 6:8 as sort of being faithful to what God calls us to, right? And you could pick a whole bunch of different verses. good, great commission, the faithfulness to go out and care for the world. There's, you could talk about, the golden rule, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, loving your neighbor as yourself. But Micah 6:8 kind of creates a really cool benchmark for us. And that, what does God ask of us? That we act justly, that we love mercy, and we walk humbly with him, right? And if that can become the fruit that we are faithful to, what a powerful testimony, right? And the opposite of that is that we care only for ourselves, not about others, right? We don't act justly. We worry about us. We don't really care about mercy or reaching out for people who are hurting, and we think we pretty much have it all figured out. And I wonder, boy, that sounds an awful lot like a lot of our world right now. I mean, I have, as we've been kind of having all these conversations around this race stuff, and this is what Brian talked about here, that that there's a lot of that where I just have not wanted or bothered to act justly in our world, that I haven't sought out and loved mercy, right? That I haven't walked humbly in the conversations or situations. And yet, and because of that, there is a lot of pain in our world, and I'm part of that. So how do we begin to work on facing into those things and those parts of ourselves, but at the same time not just blowing with every wind of cultural, right? Like there's this sense of, there's all this cultural pressure. Oh, okay, now you need to care about this. And how do we pursue that faithfulness to God and his heart, and recognize where we haven't done that well, but at the same time not just jump on the bandwagon and be blown around by whatever the cultural norms are? Does that question make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Before you move on, Trevor, I sent you, Terry added a comment on Facebook. She says, sometimes lately I ask, if Jesus walked into this situation, how would he heal it? It helps bring my anger down.
Yeah. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate you pitching in. And actually looking over, you also, when we were talking about problems, that, she said that she needs to control things. And then, I give things to God, but then I take them back. And I think we all experience that as well. So anyway, back to how do we make that, faithfulness our focus and our main point there?
What I was going to say is that I think it just all comes back down to everybody needs food and shelter. And if everybody had food and shelter and love, there wouldn't be quite so many problems, regardless of the color of your skin. A large part of it is poverty. And so you can be a Christian and be consistent with your beliefs by concentrating on how can we solve this problem. And that just naturally rolls into all the other problems that the society faces.
Right.
And I think too, like, how we individually act. I mean, there's like the church at large, so corporately we need to love everyone, we need to offer grace, we need to seek repentance in ourselves and transformation. But then individually we're called to different things and obedience. So I mean, there's been times even lately, when Trevor and I got the stimulus checks, we both felt that, our bills are paid, we don't need it. Like, but we know people who do, or situations that do, and we had different thoughts on what that would be and what that would look like. And it's like, great, you do your thing, I do my thing, like, be obedient to that. So it wasn't like we had to completely agree that to walk with God and be obedient to God, it has to look like this. It could look different ways, and you have to, because we can't be involved in every social justice issue there is in the world, but we should be involved in helping with the ones we feel strongly about. So
yeah,
I was going to go a little bit that direction, I think, is the knowing if you make a commitment, or just you believe to follow what is right, that you always stay that path and don't veer off of it, and you're faithful to what is right. And even if there's a issue that arises. And a different kind of example is raising teenagers. You always want them to be able to say, hey, call me if you're in a situation. And, there'll be a consequence, but I will be, I'll make sure we help you. And so it's that way. I feel like it's that way with all kinds of things. You can apply that to someone who has lived in poverty and had struggled. If you make a commitment, say, I want you to do better. Are you just going to go out and keep punishing them, or are we going to try to guide them to do better? And so that's where you can have that faithfulness and gentleness, is where you're committed to doing what's good instead of, just punishing. So I think that's something to stand behind and remember, and individually we all can do.
I think the teenager example is great. Can those, not in our lives, not just our teenagers, but can those in our lives count on us to consistently and faithfully do the loving thing? And that's not always what the other person wants, but do we have that consistency to feel like they can come to us for love in various forms because they know that's our character?
Right. Yeah, actually, I mean, I really like that. And even as you guys were talking about that, I was thinking, the faithfulness is the faithfulness to love. And sometimes that requires discipline. Sometimes that requires, holding their hand when they're hurt. Sometimes that requires a hug. Sometimes it requires just encouragement for something well they're doing. But the faithfulness is to love, and, to love that person. And I think that when we talk about faithfulness, the core that we're supposed to bring to God is ourselves, right? Like, God, I want to be faithful to what you call me to, kind of like Schnett was talking about. And that allows a level of flexibility, right? That allows a level of new conversations and realizations where we can say, I'm faithful to God. I'm faithful to trying to love our world. What does that look like in this situation, in this place? And, kind of like we were talking about, sometimes maybe that's saying, okay, like on a race thing, like, what have I missed? Like, where, if this isn't my experience, what is yours, and what have I missed, and how can I help with that? Or, okay, God says, you know what, this is something that is unjust and needs to be fixed. I'm calling you to go do that. And the faithfulness is not to the ideology, not to the church, kind of like we talked about, not to a specific pastor or leader, but it's a faithfulness to love and to try and grow, right? Maybe even a faithfulness to surrender. Which I'm thinking about it, how often have people been faithful to ideologies that ultimately end up being destructive and painful, right? Melissa, you were talking about being Lutheran. How many religious wars were fought between the Lutherans and the Catholics because they were faithful to their ideology and somehow missed the bigger picture. So with that, unless somebody had a thought on that, the next word was gentleness, right? And Brian defined it as humble, considerate of others, submissive to God and his word. And that the Spirit draws out of us this sense of gentleness in the world. Boy, that's another one that I, unfortunately, a lot of times I don't see in Christians, where we're not.
Where we need the Spirit, because it is not our first response in most situations, especially when things get confrontational, right? Last thing I want is to be gentle.
Right. Not in like a passive, I never have a voice kind of a way, but in I walk gently into the world. I'm gentle with people and their souls, their understanding. Why? Oh, go ahead.
I would say we've have feminized that word, so I think men have a hard time with it, saying gentle is weak. And to, like, I don't know, like many things in the world, we need to reclaim it, because it being meek, being gentle is not weakness. So as I don't know, as Aaron was talking, it made me think of that gender bias we have in our world, is that associating certain qualities of God as masculine or feminine rather than virtues and character.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can macho it up a bit by call it, strategic or playing the long game. And what I think of is, I think of the guy on the corner waving a sign and preaching about, whatever, and passing out tracts. Like, he's loud, he's obnoxious, he's blaring, he's not gentle, he's not playing the long game. He doesn't know anybody he's preaching to. He doesn't really care. The average stranger on the street isn't going to take my advice on shampoo, much less a lifelong commitment to a religion. Gentleness, I think, is stopping, evaluating the situation, playing the long game, asking God for guidance instead of just a one-size-fits-all megahorn and a sign on the corner.
Yeah, absolutely.
It takes a little more investment, a little more commitment. It's playing the long game.
Mm-hmm. And a little more.
That's where. Oh, go ahead.
No, go for it.
See, well, that kind of comes back around to the. Most of my examples come from raising teenagers, I guess, at this point in time in life, and the gentleness where you get that, you've told your kids, call me, and then you get that phone call and they're like, we rolled a vehicle and we're out in the middle of nowhere, and you have to, like, your first response is, mad, like that's what you want to be, but then you're like, no, they called me. And so then approaching them first, okay, you're like, all right, I have to make sure, are they okay? So are they okay? Do they need a hug? Do they need help? Like, those are the things, when you talk about gentleness and faithfulness, those are the kind of qualities you can apply to situations all the way across the board. And anything, if someone needs to be heard, they want their story heard, they just need somebody to be there for them. That's where you can apply that and practice that. And that's where having faith can come through.
Right. Kind of to Shanette's point, Terry was saying on Facebook that the world does not honor submissive people, and I think that's true. But there is an aspect of gentleness that's not just submissive, right? It's about walking carefully with what you are. Shanette mentioned the word meekness, right? And that's very similar, and it's power under control. So it's knowing who you are, having this connection with God, this strength, but it's under control, and you're willing to walk carefully into other people's world and not beat them or something like that. So Shanette, they're chatting here, and Shanette was just asking Tracy if he was the one that was called by Sarah when she got in trouble with the car. So.
No, that was her daughter. She was talking about. I think gentleness too, since I'm on here, is, I think a lot of times for me, when I look at it, is the way I react to things, and with loving and caring, and not overreacting to situations, and allowing myself to process that. For me, it's kind of how I take that.
Right. Well, and I think kind of going back to the race stuff right now, I mean, there is a lot of opinions that are flying around in Christian circles. Those are the ones I'll pick on because, that's my family, that aren't gentle, right? There isn't a sense of, I want to hear, I want to understand, I want to connect, or I want to try and hold what you're saying carefully. There's a pushback and a resistance and a worst case scenario, just outright anger and demeaning. I think we need to be really careful about that, and of course with the race stuff, but then in all different kinds of spheres, right? I mean, I think it would be really, really hard to have a conversation about whether or not we should elect Trump without it being not gentle. Why is that so hard in our world? Why is that so difficult?
Maybe it comes down to identity, right? Rather than seeing common identity in Christ, it's very easy to draw up the battle lines of red versus blue because we feel identity. Maybe that's where, especially as Americans, we need to check ourselves, figure out which team we play for, and it's not either or.
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes down to listening too. So I have people I consider to be friends who have very different political beliefs than I do, and I have to watch my words to be gentle, right? And self-control, because I don't want to upset the apple cart on that friendship. But at the same time, I need to stand by my values that I personally believe in. And it's sometimes it's easier to say nothing, and that's a whole different ballgame too.
Mm-hmm.
If you say nothing, there will be no fruits.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's part of the gentleness, right? Is knowing when to say and when not to. I mean, this is it's been a fun life lesson for me. I have extremely liberal family members that, well, they're just extremely liberal, and I have some family members that border on anarchists, and I have some family members that are extremely conservative Christian and voting wise, and we can all have Thanksgiving together most of the time.
Finding common ground and building from there, choosing your battles,
Mm-hmm.
making sure you vote.
So with that, with that gentleness in mind, I do think I liked what you said, Aaron, about the identity piece. Like, who do we identify ourselves with? And if it's not Christ, then it's, I don't know, maybe an idol. And that gets threatened, right?
I'm a firm believer that everybody's looking for a God. Even the atheists, everybody is looking for someone, some cause, some ideal to follow, and that becomes their identity.
And so as Christians, one of the best ways I think we can help with that is to stay self-controlled, right? Which is mastery over ourselves, and our oftentimes lack of restraint, the ability to be like, not out there just controlled by the environment around us, but to be controlled by ourselves and our nature. And that is, there again, something that I think we oftentimes lack deeply, right? Where we're not able to, and I'm having a hard time articulating this point, but not able to let God control us and to lead us, but we try and take control. And that gets really destructive. So in that sense of self-control, how do we let God develop that in us, right? How do we begin to let God transform and change us in that? I don't know if that was kind of a convoluted question or not, but
I think I would just say practice.
I think keeping an open mind to life and looking at different perspectives on things, it can be very helpful in any situation, seeing it from different views.
Yeah. I think it can become, and this goes back to the analogy right at the beginning with the pig and the cat, right? There can be an aspect of self-control where we try and force ourselves to do the right works. And that is not what this is talking about. This is talking about staying rooted and grounded in ourselves, and letting our principles and ourselves guide us, the love of God guide us, not be out of control by the winds of the world around us. Well, I think that's one of those fruits that sometimes takes a while to develop. So kind of wrapping this up, because we're getting down near the end of our time. I go back to what Brian started this whole series off with, and that was Wesley's 3 simple rules that he lived by, which was do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. And I think those are the kind of principles that we can use to negotiate our way through this world as Christians, where we're not doing harm to the best of our ability, where we're striving to do good, and we're staying in love with God. And as that all happens, somehow miraculously God works this out inside of us. Which the final piece that Brian talked about in all of that was right now in the midst of the COVID pandemic, wearing masks. I'll throw that out there. I know it's for some people it's controversial, and it's interesting because most of the time I think it's controversial because of that identity piece, like you were talking about, Aaron. I mean, if we want to have a legitimate discussion on the effectiveness and efficacy of masks and whatever, that's one thing. But this sense of I don't or I do, and I hate those who do or don't. Man, I want to get past all this stuff. Like, even if they don't do anything, I'm gonna wear one. But I don't know. I mean, you guys can weigh in on that if you want, but I'm just giving honor to a point that Brian made pretty emphatically in the sermon, that I happen to agree with. But yeah, Sarah.
Okay, so I live in Nebraska where we are not up, we're actually down, but I'm very close to Denver. So where we live, nobody wears them. Like, very few people wear them, and they give you dirty looks if you wear them, and they just think you're just this crazy nut for having it on. But then, like, we go to Denver and everybody has them on, and everybody's respecting that, and so it's interesting to see kind of the difference. And we typically will wear a mask, and our kids have them if I have to take them to a store, and they're very well, we just ignore everybody and who cares. But yeah, it's interesting the different pockets of areas that wear them. And Denver just got reached back down, I guess, because enough people weren't wearing them. So I think it's a common courtesy. Like, it doesn't hurt anything. Just keep
Right.
on.
You're kind of dropping out there, but
Oh,
yeah. Were you going to say something, Margene?
I was going to say, I agree with Sarah, and it's about how we want to look as a Christian. And, like Aaron was saying, you go out there and preach and do all your judging and everything. That's not the way we're going to draw people to Christ. And the Bible says to respect authority. And I agree with Sarah. I mean, it's not that big a deal. And it's requested right now, and I don't have a problem with it either. But I just, like, we all have our gods. People can make anything a god. Whether it's with their beliefs, of their conservative beliefs, their liberal beliefs, their social media, whatever. But if you are respecting and putting the Lord first in your life, I think you should look inward at yourself and how you are representing Christ. And I think it's totally fine to wear a mask. That's just my
Oh.
opinion.
Terry says, I am old. Please wear a mask. And here's my thought as a physician. If the masks are proven to do nothing in them of themselves, they're reminding you to keep your distance, to wash your hands, and stop touching your face. So in that alone, they are doing something.
But going back to the divide, I had a friend post just this morning something about, you Trump supporters pick a dumb hill to die on. I thought, what? It was just equating all these people. If you voted for Trump, you also don't wear a mask. Like, that's it. A equals B. There's no in between. There's no wish, And I was like, well, you might want to change your wording on that because, it's really not very helpful, And I got shot down. She's like, that's what they believe.
All of them, right?
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that goes back to what we've been talking about in this whole thing, right? Are we faithful to our identity in God and trying to serve him? Are we gentle as we walk into the world? That doesn't mean we're spineless, but we're gentle with other people. So we seek to do good to them. And can we hold ourselves in self-control and process and think and act the way God would have us do it? That's why I hope that as Christians, that as a church, through this sermon series and through hopefully some of these discussions, there's a little bit of a reminder, like, it's not all about us. It's not all about control. It's not all about comfort. And in the midst of all the craziness going on in our world, that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control should be our hallmarks. And if they're not, then, well, we need to stop and bring ourselves to God and surrender him. It's just like our salvation's not by works. Neither is our transformation. So thank you all for joining in tonight. Thank you for helping wrap up this sermon series. And this next week, we're going to have a one-off for the weekend. I'm going to be preaching for kind of 4th of July, which will be sort of fun. I'm looking forward to that. That's why Brian's not in. He actually has the week off. And then and something I do want to put out is next Wednesday night for our town talk. So not tomorrow, but the following one. We're having a really cool panel to discuss the stuff that's been going on with the racism and the different issues surrounding that. So Josie Villa, our head of HR for the church, sits on the board there, as well as Wayne Martin, who sits on the board at Cadillac, and a handful of other people are going to be having a conversation and listening to stories. So if you're out there, I'd really encourage you to tune into that, because that'll be a really cool conversation. And tomorrow for Wednesday night, I'm going to be talking to Eduardo down in Honduras for our town talk. So that'll be pretty fun too. So anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we'll look forward to connecting with you again later. Bye.